Okay, so let's jump right into a political idea that's, well, pretty counterintuitive when you first hear it. We're going to explore how a ruler, even when they seem to be at their weakest point, can actually get stronger, not because of anything they're doing, but because of their opponent's mistakes. How on earth does that work? Let's get into it. Yeah, this is the big question, right? It just doesn't seem to make sense. You'd think your rival messing up would automatically be good for you. But, as we're about to see, in the world of political strategy, this dynamic is very, very real. In fact, it can be what makes or breaks a campaign. And that brings us right to our case study for today, Turkey. Look over on the left. President Erdoğan's government is under a ton of pressure. We're talking major economic problems, institutions that are fraying at the seams. Really, by a lot of measures, it's in a very vulnerable spot. But then look at the right. Something strange is happening. The opposition, through its own actions, is actually helping to stabilize his position. How? By making that moral gap between them smaller and smaller. Let's unpack that. All right, so first up, this political paradox. A moment of real government weakness is leading to a result that nobody really expected. You know, if you took Political Strategy 101, the playbook for this is super clear. The opposition's main job right now should be to be everything the government isn't. They need to be disciplined, they need to be squeaky clean, and they need to create this huge, obvious moral gap so that voters can look and say, okay, that is a real alternative. Yeah, but that is not what's happening. Not even close. Instead, you've got this growing list of controversies that are doing the exact opposite. They're blurring the lines. And this brings us to a perfect and very recent example. So let's zoom in on what's being called the vacation scandal. It's a textbook case of how one seemingly small error by an opposition mayor can just explode into a massive crisis of credibility. Okay, so let's walk through this timeline. First, you've got a crisis brewing. Sanitation workers are protesting because they haven't been paid, and garbage is literally piling up in the streets. Then, boom, photos hit the internet. It's the mayor on a fancy vacation in Phuket. The timing is just awful. And then comes the final blow. It turns out his vacation partner is a musician who, surprise, surprise, gets paid to perform at city events. It's just a perfect storm of bad optics and questionable judgment. And just like that, the whole story gets turned on its head. A situation that should have been a huge political win for the opposition, standing with workers, pointing out government failure, suddenly becomes a story about their own mayor's lifestyle, his judgment, and potential cronyism. The entire narrative gets hijacked. But here's the thing, and this is so important to understand. This wasn't just a one-off mistake. What the source material points to is that this is actually part of a much bigger and, frankly, more troubling trend. And it's not just this one scandal in Bucha. In other major cities run by the opposition, like Istanbul, there's been this constant drip, drip, drip of allegations. We're talking about everything from how big contracts are handed out, to who gets hired for certain jobs, to how these city-run companies are operating behind closed doors. It's a steady stream of unforced errors. And this is where the strategy gets really smart or cynical, depending on how you look at it. The government doesn't actually need any of these allegations to end in a conviction. They don't have to prove anyone's guilty in a court of law. All they have to do is plant that little seed of doubt in the public's mind, because in politics, doubt is an incredibly powerful weapon. Which brings us to the core idea of this whole explainer, what we're calling survival through comparison. It's the engine that takes all these opposition screw-ups and turns them into political gold for the government. It all boils down to this idea of moral asymmetry. Think about it like this. If you're trying to sell a new phone to someone who's used the same brand for a decade, your phone can't just be a little better. It has to be way better. It has to be a total game changer. It's the exact same thing in politics. For people to take the risk of change, the opposition has to be seen as fundamentally different, more ethical, more disciplined, just better. Because the second that moral high ground disappears, the second that gap between them starts to close, the government gets to use its most powerful propaganda weapon, this simple little phrase right here. They're all the same. It's absolutely devastating because it sucks all the energy out of the room. It kills the main reason anyone would vote for change in the first place. So what does this playbook actually look like in action? Well, it's a 4-step process, and it is brutally effective. Step 1, an opposition figure messes up. Step 2, the government's media machine grabs a story and blows it up, making sure everyone sees it. Step 3, that seed of doubt we talked about gets planted. And then step 4, the knockout punch. The average voter looks at all this and thinks, you know what? Why would I risk everything for more of the same? And just like that, the will to fight for change just evaporates. And that right there, that's the end game. The government doesn't have to convince you that the economy is great or that their policies are working. They don't have to win by persuasion anymore. They can win just by surviving, by creating this sense of equivalence that makes the opposition look just as bad as they are. Okay, so we get the strategy. But why does it matter so much right now? Why are these scandals so incredibly damaging at this particular moment? Well, the context is everything. This quote from the source material really hits the nail on the head. In a country where the central government has so much power, these opposition-run cities aren't just in charge of picking up the trash. They are living, breathing prototypes of what an alternative government might actually look like. They're a public beta test for the entire country to watch. And you have to remember the context here. We're talking about a country with insane inflation, where people's trust in major institutions is at rock bottom. So these city governments are being watched under a microscope. Every decision they make, every vacation, every contract, it's all symbolic. Every little mistake gets amplified 1,000 times because people see it as a preview of how they'd run the whole country. All right, this all leads us to our final point, the incredibly high cost of public cynicism, and how a bunch of small, seemingly defensible actions can add up to one giant political headache. Because we've all heard these kinds of justifications, right? And if you look at them one by one, they almost sound reasonable. Oh, the vacation was planned months ago. Well, technically, the contract followed all the rules. The concert was within the approved budget. Each excuse on its own seems plausible. But here's the thing about politics. None of this happens in a vacuum. It all adds up. And when you stack all these stories and all these little excuses on top of each other, a very different narrative starts to form. It's the story of an opposition that's gotten a little too comfortable, one that's more focused on managing the little bit of power it has than on fighting to change the system. And that's why, at the end of the day, Erdoğan's biggest advantage isn't his economic plan or some new policy. It's having an opposition that keeps forgetting one of the most basic rules of politics. When you're under this much pressure, how things look, the optics, eventually becomes the reality in the minds of voters. Perception becomes policy. Which leaves all of us with one final and really tough question. It's the whole thing in a nutshell. If the lines get so blurry that voters look at the people in power and then look at the alternative, and they can't see any real difference, why on earth would they risk everything to vote for change?